So let me just, right, here we go. So if you weren't respond yesterday, thank you very much for coming. But hopefully it won't be too boring. I'm not going to try and just completely redo that presentation. And if you weren't there, well, you get a little bit of a taste of the conference yesterday. I've been doing web stuff for just about 20 years. It's changed my life. It's been an extraordinary thing. I think if you know me, you know I'm very passionate about the web, both as a defender of it, a spruiker of it. And because I've been around for a lot of the web, I kind of, by osmosis, have kind of absorbed a lot of its history. And I've sort of, for a lot of reasons, I feel a bit of a custodian, a bit of a historian of the web, and I do a few projects along those lines. And I kind of always trying to collect things about the history of the web, particularly the technologies, the standards, the browsers, those sort of. I'm not particularly interested if this is the first time we had boo.com or something. I'm really much more interested in the enabling technology. So what I wanted to talk about for a few minutes was how do we get to where we are today? And if you might not have picked up the reference in the title there, but it's actually from a Talking Heads song, Once in a Lifetime. David Byrne, a genuine genius, and in fact, Talking Heads, I think, tremendously inspiring because for another like a punk band from the 1970s in New York that became one of the biggest bands in the world, one of the most famous kind of groups in the world. And you know, I think there's something of the web in them that they very much stuck true to their principles, their attitudes, their philosophies, and their beliefs, and got bigger and more influential over time. They certainly didn't sell out, and even to this day, David Byrne, if you read his writing on the music industry and you listen to his music, this is a man who's very much stuck true to his principles. And I think I think we all know the web has these underlying principles, and the web's stuck to them, right? As much as other people try to co-opt the web and turn it to their own purposes, the web's kind of been able to kind of be resilient. So I want to talk a little bit about why I think that is, particularly from the perspective of the technology. So this song, it's called Once in a Lifetime, and there's a reason why I've chosen that particular quote in a way. But it starts, it's David Byrne talking to kind of someone in middle age, so someone like me, and kind of like someone like the web in a way. You may find yourself behind the wheel of a large automobile. And that's true, I have like a big Volvo because I've got 4 kids, right? So you may find yourself in a beautiful house, well I live in the bush and it's really nice, and with a beautiful wife, well it goes without saying that my wife is beautiful. And she is, right? You may ask yourself, how did I get here? So I think it, you know, like the idea, the sense of the song is like kind of these guys woken up thinking, what have I done? How did I get here, right? And I think sometimes all of us have that in life, no matter what our age is. Like, how did we get to here? So let's think about a little bit about how the web got to be what it is. And there's this really interesting thing. So you might have noticed the particular style of my slides, which was informed by the style we had for our conferences. And it's very much in the style of Barbara Kruger. And I won't explain to how we got there, but I found this, and I mean, I knew of this, but I didn't, and then suddenly it's in very much the same style. So these funny, strange things all sort of came together in the one location. As it turned out, Ethan spoke yesterday about the map and the territory, and there's a book of the very title of his presentation that uses exactly that design language that Maxine happened to find overnight. So there's all these strange currents all came together. Anyway, some of you will know I wrote this article called A Tao of Web Design. And I wrote it back, I wrote it several times, not necessarily with the same metaphors of Taoism, because I was very much involved with Tai Chi, and the Tao Te Ching was kind of something I read a lot, was interested in. But I've written the same idea several times in the late 1990s, 1999, 2000s. And I wrote that, but at the time I was published in a list apart. And we didn't have blogs really to speak of. And we certainly didn't have kind of what we call social media. There was no Twitter, there was no Facebook, there was not even like MySpace, right? So there wasn't this sense of viral idea. Things didn't spread around the world overnight. And the only reason you would know if someone actually read what you'd written was you could get emails. So I got all these various emails from people from all over the world because of that article. And one of them was from a woman in New York, and her name is Ronnie Bennett. And Ronnie, she'd been a radio producer and television producer, very successful in the 1970s and 80s. She'd been Barbara Walters' TV producer. So Barbara Walters is a kind of absolute legend of American television. And so she'd been tremendously successful. And what she wrote to me was, like, even as she was having this great success in radio and television, she always regretted she hadn't been involved in those media when they were new, when they were starting. She hadn't got the opportunity to help shape what radio and television looked like and felt like. And then what happened in the early 90s, the mid-90s, she got involved with the web, and she, through her work at NBC, and she was the producer of the first, NBC had a website for the presidential election in 1996. Now that's actually not the website, but this, I'll get to that website in a minute. NBC was really one of the groundbreaking kind of old media companies getting involved with the web as a new medium. They had this widely considered, groundbreaking website, which was the NBC's coverage of the 1996 election. And Ronnie, who's become a friend of mine through that initial contact, was the producer, and she made the observation to me that in the first email she wrote that my kind of thinking about the web as its own new medium, that was kind of the philosophy of that our web design. Sort of, she had the same observation. She sort of always regretted not being able to be involved in the early days of television and radio, but suddenly she had this opportunity to be involved in the early days of a new medium, the web. And it really was her wisdom and her experience of having been through, involved in media for 20 or 30 years before the web came along, that gave her the ability to see the web as a new medium and to realise that there was this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that she thought had passed her by. And that's where I guess that once-in-a-lifetime resonates with that. And I really think we all have that once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be involved in the web. Now, where, I made the joke, it's in middle age, but it's really still a teenager. It's really still a new and emerging medium that we really still don't entirely understand. And then we get the opportunity to help shape that. I'll touch on this one, because I think it's quite amusing. So this is the Bob Dole. I'm not sure too many people remember Bob Dole. And he was the Republican presidential election candidate. He went up against Clinton after Clinton had served the term and was widely destroyed, basically. But here's his website, which may or may not have something to do with that. So, amongst other things, I doubt there's very few actually bits of text on that. It's all probably graphics with evidence, except maybe the links. But if you notice very carefully, it's the official World Wide Web internet site, so it's not, just in case, right? Welcome to the Dole for President World Wide website. So at this point, about 70% of the actual text on this page is either the word welcome or the words World Wide Web. All of which began with W. Well, maybe there's something in that. Maybe, anyway. And then there were two links. Netscape, so it was a splash screen, right? So even in the early days, this predates Flash, right? We had splash screens. Right? Don't blame Flash for everything. Not even splash screens, right? Netscape users enter here, other user, the rest of you enter there, right? So it goes to show, one, Netscape was utterly dominant, like other, right? That included Internet Explorer and everything else, right? That's 1996. But that's kind of like what websites look like. So, even then, looking at that, some people realised there was something going on here. To look back at some of those earlier days, if you weren't there yourself, or even if you were, and you kind of when I go back and look at old screenshots and old websites, and let me tell you, from before about 96, they're almost impossible to find. Wayback Machine started in 96. Try and find screenshots from websites before 96. You will really struggle. You may find the front page of Yahoo from 94 and 95. So we've kind of lost our history, right? And I'm going to talk, that's really what I'm going to talk about for the next 10 minutes or so. And I'm going to do it in the context of these two quotes that are they juxtapose one another. So Orwell, a great cynic, but also a great genius, and who was always right about everything, said, every generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the ones that went before, and wiser than the one that comes after it. And the particular genius of the observation is that criticises everyone, because he starts at every generation. And you know what? That's true. And Newton is famous for having said this, but in fact this is a trope, a medieval trope even. There are kind of bestiaries where they have kind of pictures of giants with people on top of them. So this was an expression that was very common in the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. But if I think further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. Right? But you put those together and you get the sense that if we don't focus on history, we don't learn from history, we are, in the famous words of George Santayana, doomed to repeat it. Right? So I think we, on the web, we don't learn from our history. We've forgotten a lot of our history. And I want to talk a few things about why that's important, and most importantly, what are the lessons we've learnt that maybe we've forgotten, that we maybe should try and learn again. So there's a great line in Once in a Lifetime. It says, where does that highway lead to, right? So I think in some ways we know where the highway, we can have an idea of where that leads to based on where we've come from. So this, the web, these are very early websites, but viewed through the prism of Tim Berners-Lee's original Next browser, and there was no style in the original web, right? There was nothing stylistic in the original web. It was all the elements were semantic. There were no images, there were no fonts, right? And the other, you might say that it was a very impoverished and a very anemic medium, because it didn't have colour. It wasn't, it was very plain. But the truth is, computing at that time, some people had Macs. They were incredibly expensive, right? I couldn't afford one for many years. There was the Next, which was even more expensive. They were only ever sold about 50,000 of them anyway. But most computing was like DOS and Windows 3.0 and a lot of dumb terminals, right? And so, at the time, almost the ideal design was to not worry about graphics, because most people wouldn't see them anyway. So that first web, that early web, was actually responsive, right? Because your content, if you used HTML, would appear on all these incredibly disparate devices. And that was by design. So from its very design, and in fact, as it worked in the early 1990s, the web was responsive, right? It's in the absolute core of its DNA. And then, okay, so what happened was, this was very academic, very hobbyist. And then suddenly there was a little bit of kind of commercial interest, and so you had your more traditional media companies, which is obvious, they were ones creating content. For them, it was an obvious outlet to explore, entered into the web. And the problem was, of course, their expectations were the things would look like, desktop publishing, right? So that's the face. And there's this curious resonance again of the kind of Futura typeface, very Barbara Kruger-esque as well, right? This is the last edition of the face from the 1980s, right? So it's December 15, 1989. I actually had that, by the way. I wish I'd kept it. And as much as anything for the content, it's got things like new technology, old dogma. That's probably Julie Pushell, she's always been used, right? That's one for the English people. 19 ways to spend the 90s, and not one of them would have been surfing the internet. That worked yesterday, I don't know. Keep drinking. Important issues, Clubland after Acid House. These were the things. Who worried about that shit? Well, what are we going to do after Acid? Yeah. You were 7, Hardy. But he probably was worrying about that when he was 7, no, in Auckland. Anyway. So, but the thing is that, actually, during the 1980s, I missed that, but I'm sure it was funny. During the 1980s, this new medium, in some ways, emerged with desktop publishing, right? And the Mac and PostScript printers had driven that, and it gave voice and capability to a whole lot of people who traditionally were excluded from the medium. And it was the explosion of popular media and other niche publications. And the interesting, just little side to that is, when the web arrived, there were a whole heap of people who were ready to give it content and give it voice, because they knew how to use computers, they knew how to write electronically, they knew how to publish digitally, right? So in fact, the web didn't have to wait for people to turn up to populate it. They were there, and it was all driven through this, right? So this is what designers and people in the kind of digital media space expected to be able to do. They, this is pretty nice typography, and they wanted to do stuff like that. And yet the web was this horribly broken thing with no style and no design, right? And so we got things like this. So this is like from nearly 8 years later. This is the very early Sydney Morning Herald. It's about the oldest screenshot I could find, or Wayback Machine. This is the first entry in Wayback Machine for the Sydney Morning Herald, right? So that was the entire front page of Sydney Morning Herald in July 1997, right? As we went towards 2000, I think there's a whole section towards 2000, right? Remember that? I do. But if you look at it, you can sort of see why people who lived in this world kind of thought the web was broken and anemic. I'm not being, I wasn't critical of those people, or I'm still not. It's just that it takes a certain kind of imagination to see in that something more than in that, because they are different things. The web was different, right? But it took us a long time to learn that. So what we needed to do was create killer websites, right? So we invented all kinds of techniques like using tables for layout. Remember that one, right? Here's another awesome one. I haven't got time to kind of go into details, but basically this is how you use GIFs to create leading, right? And this is like every 4 or 5 words they put a spacer GIF in because no matter how wide or narrow the columns are, you still want the leading to work, otherwise the whole thing collapses in a screaming heap. Right, so here, 60% of the markup is just the same spacer GIF. Right. But these are the techniques people wrote whole books about because it gave designers control back, right? Because this web was this crazy thing where who knew what it was going to look like, and now users could kind of change the size of their window and zoom their text up and down. And this was a horrendous thing, right? They needed to get the control back, right? So, this was really popular, right? So you might have heard of creating killer websites. This book in 1996 was the #1 book on Amazon, right? Of all books. Right? The biggest selling book on Amazon in 1996 was a book on how to use all these killer website techniques, right? So, it seemed in a way like we were moving towards the web as a kind of print 2.0, right? If to kind of backfill a metaphor from the near future. But, we could have kept doing that. Like PDF there's a whole chapter in this book on PDF and how awesome it's going to be because it kind of means we don't have to actually render our text as images. And in fact, Acrobat 3 Server had a way in which you create PDFs and then it would serve page at a time. So basically a PDF was basically a website, right? If you had Acrobat Server. And this was a good thing in that, right? And that's where we could have kept going down that kind of evolutionary dead end, is the term I used yesterday, right? It's kind of perfect and yet misses the entire point of the web. Because it wasn't just print 2.0, it wasn't just printing on the screen. The web's bugs of being able to resize fonts and be able to flow with the way the user wanted to or needed to use the content was actually a strength rather than a weakness. And this is what I observed in 1999, 2000. And I wasn't alone. It wasn't like I was this great oracle came down from the mountain. It was the sort of thing we were talking about. I just happened to, luckily, one day come out with a way of expressing that it resonated with a lot of people. Certainly, this was definitely people were talking about this amongst the kinds of people interested in CSS and that sort of thing. But other platforms are still trying to learn, right? Because iOS, iPhone 5 comes out and all these apps kind of just have a gap there. Right? That's how unresponsive a lot of other media or a lot of other digital media kind of still are. And this is like, Android developers kind of bash their heads about the fragmentation of their platform. They mean, 2.2, 2.3, 4.1, they mean that, but they also mean all this landscape of different, sizes of devices and orientations, right? Whereas on the web, we've learned that's a feature, right? So I observed with George Santayana, right? I haven't got time to kind of read that out, but, what were the lessons that hopefully we've learned that sometimes I feel we haven't, we keep going over and over them? Well, here are the things we actually learned in the 1990s. The websites don't have to look the same in every browser, right? We learned that. It took a long time to convince everyone, but then the iOS came out, and then suddenly everyone's boss had one in their hands, and they thought, well, you know what? Yeah, our desktop site doesn't look real good on my phone, right? So it took a long time, but that's something we actually learned in the 1990s. And we learned about the separation of concerns, right? This is actually something they learned in software engineering in the 1960s. Dijkstra invented the term separation of concerns, but the web actually baked it into the technology. In software engineering, it's a practice. In the web, if you use CSS and HTML and JavaScript correctly, you get separation of concerns, right? It's engineered into what we do. And yet there are still debates about, look at Instagram. You visit that web page and it'll sit there while you wait about 8 seconds, right? And it'll arrive. So you know why? Because the whole web page is basically a JSON string injected and then built in the DOM, right? Cutting edge websites are doing, look at all these practices around single page architectures that are essentially getting rid of separation of concerns. And then all these developers out there who haven't learned these lessons are trying to argue, no, that's all old fashioned. That might work for documents, but for apps, no. Somehow we have apps too. And progressive enhancement, we learned this, people, right? We learned this lesson, we saw the benefits. And yet, I'll look to a couple of examples in a minute. And adaptive layouts, the way in which we structure our content so that it adapts to the ebb and flow of someone's constraints, to the window size, the device they're using, to the orientation, right? We learnt all this stuff 10 years before we had iPhones, right? We were so ready, and yet it took a long time to give it to a whole heap of people, right? All of those things, we had the foundations of responsive web design in the late 1990s. right? And then, you know, with Ethan's article, it was like 10 years after that, and suddenly I want to talk about responsive web design, but it's just web design in a way, right? It's just that we just have to kind of convince everyone else as the way we should do things. That I think we wasted a ton of energy on was image replacement techniques, right? Some of the best and brightest in our industry spent years coming up with these techniques for what was considered a bug of the web, right? We don't have good enough type. But in fact, it was a feature, right? And eventually we got really good typography. And we wasted years trying to work out the best way to do what essentially we shouldn't have been doing in the first place, right? You know, we have to be very mindful of where we've only got so much focus, as someone put today really well, I can't remember. I saw today someone say, there's so much time, you have so much focus. And all the focus and time you put into things that maybe don't need fixing is time you're not putting into things that maybe we really should be doing. And this one, we learned this, right? Best view, who would do that? I mean, why would you possibly do it except everyone does it still, right? And then things like Sensor Touch, not just particularly dump on them, but unless you've got a modern WebKit browser, forget about it, right? They're actually expressly saying it's only, you know, like we learnt this a decade ago, people. All right. So, you know, I sometimes think it's the same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. That's great. That's how I feel. It goes around in my head sometimes because I read these mailing lists about people coming out arguing what we thought we'd put to bed 10 years ago, right? So, I don't want to be a total downer around all this because we have come a long way, and I think the only way we know that is by looking back to where we came from, right? And maybe partly if we were there and we learnt those lessons, we should be ashamed of them, right? We shouldn't think, you know, sometimes I'm ashamed to talk about progressive enhancement, things like, oh, it sounds so old and fuddy-duddy, or, you know, but I don't think they are. I think they stand the test of time. They are somehow at the cornerstone of the web, is these principles of design and development. And, you know, as new people coming in our industry, I think we need, rather than berate them, or treat them like imbeciles, although there's the temptation sometimes to do that, really kind of try and teach them these lessons if we know them. And if we don't know them, let's go back and have a look at the lessons that were learned. Because, you know, we could, again, like, you know, in this sort of modern web app world, we could you know, like one of the great criticisms of the web now, like in the olden days it was broken because it wasn't like print, right? And now it seems to me it's often the web's broken because it's not like apps, right? And the web's got to compete with native apps or it's going to die. There's all this hand-wringing and we go, you know, I'm not saying the web's perfect. I'm not saying we shouldn't be improving without a doubt, but we should be, where that highway leads should be informed from where we've come from, right? We should know, we don't want to wake up sometime in our middle age and say, how did I get here? We know how we got here and there are lessons in that. Because, you know, that same sense of excitement and opportunity, that same sense that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that I had in the 90s, late 90s, around the web, I think it's still there today. I think the web is really only beginning to show us its promise. I think there is a way of interacting with computing that, you know, iOS and these apps, they're kind of very polished and they're very sexy, but they're kind of evolutionary dead ends as well, right? And we have to find the genius of the web and what can it do? What makes it better by being different? And I've got a heap of ideas around that as well, but today's not the day for that. But hopefully you share with me that excitement and that interest. And you know, really, hopefully we can observe the times we're going down the rabbit holes of wasting our energy on things that maybe, you know, they're going to get solved in time. Let's actually think about what the web does best. What makes it a medium? Right? That's our once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I really feel that, and I hope you do too. Thanks.